I'm Dr. Steve Kuniak, and I teach in the graduate counseling department. So for most folks, we're over in Whiting Hill. We may not see each other very much, but yeah. So my area of research is in the use of gaming, and I explored from a couple different perspectives. When I was asked to do this discussion, it was on my dissertation topic, which was a cultural exploration of gaming. So I do believe that gaming or gamers are part of a unique subculture, and I'll sort of identify that or define that as we go along. But I've also looked at gaming from the perspective of, so if there are so many people out there who are gaming, and we'll talk about how many people who identify as gamers. First off, what does that mean for me as a counselor? So like from a mental health perspective, stereotypically and historically, we counselors have seen gaming as bad, right? That's kind of like the knee-jerk reaction. Anytime I introduce myself and say I'm a gamer, I hear, well, that's bad for you, right? Or when I go into when I was practicing, when I had my private practice, I would have families who would come in and the parents would say, you need to fix my kid, he games too much, right? That's the go-to. And then there's also that current unfortunate perspective that gaming leads automatically like one-to-one to violence or aggression. And so we'll kind of talk about some of those sort of things too as we go. But I wanted to look at gaming from the perspective of what is important from a mental health perspective. And so we'll take a look at culturally, why is this unique or important? And then also what I sort of pulled up for my study on gaming was what are the coping methods that gamers might use, and what are their resiliency levels and things like that. So like how do they bounce back from difficult life circumstances? Because again, I think the stigma is that they don't, right? That these behaviors are maladaptive in some way. What I found is a little bit counter to that, and then kind of take a look at some of the newer stuff too that's coming up. So, like I said, I identified early on in my dissertation sort of building research process that gaming I thought was a culture. And so, from a mental health perspective, we're called to be multicultural. We're called to, like our ethics code actually identifies that we have to practice multiculturally. We have to give a nod, no matter what is going on, to culture. And so we have a definition of culture, and so I borrowed the Baruth and Manning definition of culture for my dissertation, and it says that a culture is any institution, communication, value, religion, gender, sexual orientation, disabilities, thinking, artistic expression, and social and interpersonal relationships, that those are all aspects of defining a culture, that those all, when we pull them together, are the underpinnings of a culture. So, I'm going to try to dissect that for you to the best of my abilities. And I sort of came on this, my dissertation chair and I were talking one day, and he said, you keep using the word gamer. What is a gamer? We need to operationalize that. If you're going to do an actual quantitative research study on gamers, then we need to know what that is. And that's when we came to the idea of I don't know what a gamer is. Like I know in my mind what, like it's one of those things where if I see it, I know it, but I don't know how to identify it, so it became a part of the dissertation as well. So just this quote here by Dr. Jason Allaire of the North Carolina State University Gains Through Gaming Lab. People of all ages play video games. There is no longer a stereotype game player, but instead a game player could be your grandparent, your boss, or even your professor. So I'm curious. I'm a gamer. I've been gaming since I was about 3 years old. So I literally was born with a controller in my hands almost. Almost. Other gamers in the group? Okay, so let the record show about 6 or 7 of us. So, okay. I'm curious when we get done talking about this, how many of you may shift that, and you may find that you have some gaming qualities about you. So my wife and I talk sometimes about people in our lives who will say to me, or who will look to me as the gamer and say that they're not gamers, but then they actually spend probably 3 times more time on their tablet or mobile device playing games than I do on my Xbox. So who's the gamer, right? I will say that my move into full-time academics has kept me much busier. I'm not playing as many games as I once did, but that's okay. So these terms kind of get used, Doctor Who fan or geek? These terms kind of get used together sometimes, because if I talk to you about my gaming habits or the things that interest me, that aligns with what people will call a geek or a nerd too. And so those cultures actually kind of crisscross. Now there are people who will say, I'm a geek, I'm not a gamer. And there are people who will say, I'm a gamer, not a geek. But you'll find that a lot of these things kind of intersect. And so I wanted to talk about, as you walked in the room, you all had ideas about what a gamer was, whether you saw it as yourself, or whether you saw it as someone else that you know, or again, something problematic or otherwise. But these are the things that I've heard over the years about when I say I research gamers, or I work with gamers, or whatever the case may be. These are things that I've come across. So I've had people say games are for children. I've had people say adults who read comic books are freaks. We've got that. Now I will say, and my wife can attest to this, I have a ton of comic books. So if there is a freak in the world, it's me. People who play games all day will get addicted and have no social life. So gaming as an addiction is definitely a concern that we run across a lot of times. I've had, like I said, if I had 10 parents come into my office, 9 of those 10 parents identified that their child was addicted to gaming. Now, of those 9 parents, I would say that maybe 1 in 9 actually had like what I would consider identifiers of addiction, addictive behavior. Were there problematic issues going on? Were there other, was gaming maybe something that we needed to look at or unpackage? Yeah, probably. But oftentimes what I was finding was that was more of a symptom rather than the actual underlying issue. And if we could get to the issue, we could alleviate some of the symptom, or even find a way to make that symptom become something useful or valuable in that healing process. So, but that having been said. So, people who play games are more violent. Again, something that I've got quite a lot of, my kid plays video games, he's going to go in and shoot up the place or something like that. I'm worried about this. I do think that there are concerns with overexposure to violence and violent imagery leading to some problems, but I will start by saying that violence is a behavior, it's an act, and so thinking and feeling have to come into play with that too, and any sort of behavior implies choice, right? So if I asked you right now, everyone in the room, to hate me right now, can you hate me? Just hate me. It's hard to change emotions. It's hard to change emotional reactions to situations. If I get you to try to think of, or not, let's do it this way. How about don't think of a pink elephant standing right here in the room? You all thought of the pink elephant, right? We all do. So thinking, you can make it go away, you can change it, but it's hard, right? Thinking is something that is kind of a knee-jerk reaction sort of process. But if I ask you to raise your right hand right now, all of you, raise your right hand. There was some hesitation, some of you did, some of you still haven't. There's choice. Raising your hand is a behavior. Choice, right? So there's a part to this that I think is just critically important. I don't think games have a hypnotic effect on people is what I'm getting at. I don't think if you play a lot of Call of Duty, you will automatically become aggressive. I think that there are a lot of other steps that go along with that process. So, people who play games and like superheroes live in a fantasy world. I think there's a part of that, certainly. I like being in my fantasy world. How many of you folks like to drift off and be in another place for a little while? And let me ask, if you could be, like if you think of the thing that you wanted to be as a kid more than anything else in the world, and you could be that for a few hours, wouldn't you? Like, really? I would. I do. That's how I spend my time. There's some therapeutic value to indulging in that. We don't see a problem with kids doing that stuff, but I'm curious where the cutoff is, where all of a sudden now it's a problem, right? So a lot of the psychologists of old, like Bruno Bettelheim, would talk about the uses of enchantment, the uses of fantasy, that there is utility to this. And all of a sudden, at some age, we cut it off and say, no, it's abnormal. But I don't know when that is. So, I added this one just over the weekend. Gamers are just adults who live in their mom's basements. I've heard that one a lot. I have never lived in my mom's basement. I've lived on my own or independently for much of my life, and I mean, after I got out of high school, and I've been gaming all of that time, so not in my mom's basement. In fact, I don't know anyone who lives in their mom's basement who is of my gaming group. I mean, I'm sure it's possible. And lastly, gamers can't have relationships. And interestingly enough, a lot of the folks that I've gamed with are in very successful, happy relationships. Some folks met each other through gaming or enhanced their relationship through their gaming activities, met each other at the local comic book store or something like that, playing a tabletop game. There are even stories of folks who have met each other like in World of Warcraft or in an online game environment. They met in a virtual space and then migrated that to a physical space after they got to know each other. It happens. But these are some of those stereotypes that I think come out a lot of times when we start talking about gamers. So who are gamers really? Like if we look culturally at gamers. I dug up some information. So the Entertainment Software Association, the ESA, is a nonprofit organization that keeps data on market research data on gaming. Every year they come out with a new study on this stuff. They're also, interestingly enough, and we'll talk about this a little later, these are the folks who also rate video games. They've been doing a video game rating system since 1994, nonprofit organization. But this is some of the data that's out there. So the average age of a gamer is in that mid-30s range, typically. We typically, again, I think that a lot of folks think of gamers as being kids, right? Or adults who are maladaptive in some way. But technically, the data shows that gamers are right around my age. Like I'm your stereotypical gamer, mid-30s age. And interestingly enough, with the 27 data, they put out that the female gaming population of 37 years of age or so is greater than all of the teen population of gamers. So female gamers are becoming the biggest population of gamers out there, active gamers out there. So now that's not to say that the split is still kind of 59-41 male to female, but of the populations that are increasing, we're seeing a larger group of female gamers coming out there. I just think that's interesting, useful data.
Got a question?
Oh, question?
Yeah. Can you just, when you have that graph, what would be the definition of a gamer? Because gamer is simply one who plays games, or is like at what point is an hourly cutoff, or can you just give some working definition?
So yeah, I mean, so I think all of this stuff that I'm going over will tie together to give you some conception of what a gamer is. But I will say, since you're asking that now, maybe now is a good time to talk about that. When I did my dissertation, my IRB application, my informed consent, I had that you had to be over 18 years of age to participate, and you had to identify as a gamer. Okay? So I had 600 participants roughly in my dissertation data. I went to a big gaming convention, and I actually had to shut down a day early because I ran out of paper and pencil tests for the number of people who came up and wanted to fill out study samples, and we'll talk about the cons a little later. But so, of those 600, all of those individuals, in order to take that informed consent, said, I'm a gamer, right? So in my metric that I'd worked up, I had a carryover question that said, do you identify as a gamer, yes or no? When I was originally putting that in there, I moved it over to the informed consent, but I left it. And so when I was looking at the data later, I had people who, yes, identified as a gamer on the informed consent, but then as a verb, do you identify as a gamer? There were people who put no. So I don't have an understanding, because I didn't have any follow-up question to that, because I didn't intend for that to be a thing, but I have a sort of a question in my mind about, I believe that gamers, maybe, the chief component of this is self-identification. So what determines a gamer or not is whether or not you believe you're a gamer or not. There are people who game a lot more than I do, who will never call themselves a gamer. Whereas there's me who goes out there, I average maybe, on a good week, 4 or 5 hours a week gaming, like total. But if you see me outside of college, outside of the school, I'm wearing my Halo and Call of Duty T-shirts, and I have my keychains have various gaming things on them. And if you go to my basement, it is full of gaming memorabilia. Like that's me. I'm a gamer, truly. I subscribe to gaming boxes, and I get gaming emails, and I live this stuff. But someone who games more often may still not call themselves or not identify themselves a gamer. So I think there's a large portion of this cultural stuff that we're going to go over. I have not found a good metric that says X number of hours you are a gamer. What I found more so is ask someone. And if they identify as or not, that's really the biggest qualifier to gamer or not. I wish there was a better way to do it. Like I wish there was a better way to assess that. I will say that I think stigma plays into this too to some degree. And that's a huge part that we're going to have to talk about as we go on, because as you heard in the discussion this morning, what was it about the student who would rather speak to a stranger on Fortnite than talk to their professor in their office? Mm-hmm. That's pretty common. There's a significant mistrust among gamers around other professionals, because we feel like you're not going to like us, that you've already assessed us and judged us, and you think that we do something useless. And so we're not going to tell you about it. We're going to pretend like that's not a thing until we know we can trust you or not. Whereas when someone used to come into my office when I had my private practice and I have my if you come over to Whiting Hill and you walk into my office now, I have my Minecraft figures out. It looks like my office was in my practice. my Minecraft figures, my Fallout figures, my Halo Spartans are all over my walls and stuff like that. The goal was that if a client walked in and they saw that, all of a sudden I bridged a gap. They don't have to ask, they know. And I created a safe space, because you would be surprised the number of people who walked in before I put that stuff in there, and I didn't know for months that they were open to this area of discussion, and we wrestled with their depression and their anxiety symptoms, and we talked about all this stuff, and finally they came up with I was watching this episode of Doctor Who, or whatever the case may be, and oh my God, we can talk about this now. And then therapeutic breakthrough. Like, we bypassed months of work because now we're speaking the same language. But they were afraid to tell me that, because I'm the mental health professional and I'm going to look down on them, is kind of the thought process. So I just started filling my office with stuff that was going to let them know, without me having to speak about it, that they were safe. So I hope I answered, even though I've created more ambiguity, but we'll get to that to some degree. And I'd encourage you all to think about it, and maybe you have a better metric than I do. I'm certainly willing to put that out there. So what else makes up a culture? So we talked about institutions, communications, values, religions, sexual orientations, and disabilities. I struggled with trying to, like that other data that I just showed you about the male-female stuff, if you find the right research study, you can get kind of a sampling of that sort of demographic information. But I struggled with how you convey a value system. And then I figured it out. So I just want to point out to you, if you all like podcasts, we talked about podcasts earlier and stuff like that, the Geek Therapy podcast show is a fantastic resource. A colleague of mine, Josue Cardona, has been doing this for years. I've been on the show a couple of times. They have everything that's good about the geek and gamer world on that show. Just a great resource, and I didn't tell him I was going to do this, but I wanted to make sure I gave a shout out. I actually created a nonprofit organization where I draw in a lot of the stuff that I think is useful, which is actually why I'm recording this right now. The hope that I can create a media database to be able to provide folks for information. My nonprofit is called Experience Points, gaming theme. So there's some places you can go to find out a little bit more about these value systems. But I thought it's fantastic to see gamers are huge charity buffs. So there's a lot of support among nonprofit and charitable organizations among the gaming community. Every year there's a big effort called Gamers for Giving that goes on, where a bunch of charities come together, people play video games for like 24, 48 hours straight and raise money. But of all the charities, there's not like a consensus about how much money has been produced for charities in one database. So I went along and tried to count all of the charities that I knew about that are gaming themed. And I came up with, in 2017, gaming charities raised about $20 million for their efforts. It's a very giving group who want to see social change happen. Additionally, these big conventions that go on in the world have diversity lounges where a lot of these organizations that I'm going to show you set up shop. So here's this is just a small tidbit of gaming value-oriented charitable organizations. There's a lot more. Some of them are really clever, right? Anxiety Gaming is one that just had a big fundraiser going on. Anxiety Gaming is a nonprofit, a charitable organization that attempts to help people who are struggling with mental health needs find the help that they need. So it tries to connect someone who's looking for help with a professional who's going to be supportive of them. Child's Play is a charity run by the folks who do, it's got started by the guys who do Penny Arcade. They, for example, will raise money and then build gaming carts to put in hospitals. So the kids who are struggling, getting well after some significant health issue, have something comfortable to help them get through with that. So they donate these gaming carts free of charge to hospitals, and actually they have raised so much money. They started giving them to women's shelters and for abuse victims and things like that. So you're taken from your home and put into a shelter. You can have this to try to keep you comfortable. And so they have appropriately ranged games already packaged within these carts for the various ages that they're trying to cater to. The Bodana group is actually a group of therapists who are in York, just a little bit south of here, who do work with children from a mental health perspective. GamerX is an LGBTQ gamer-friendly group, and Stack Up is a military organization. And Game Church is actually a group of gamers who seek to identify Christian belief system with themes in gaming to to blend the two and try to take it back to an old school value system and help people that way. Enable Gamers, lastly, is a charity that helps folks who are handicapped, who have physical handicaps of sorts, to get into the hobbies and activities that they love. So, and I picked these guys at random. There are dozens more of charities out there that are gamer-centric, trying to do good in the world. I could have spent the entire time talking about that. But I think that when you see a group's charitable organizations, it kind of speaks to the values that that group has. So like you can see what's important to the gamers out there. There's more. And so, I love that picture, right? So there's a community among gamers. Like I said, if someone walks into my office and we speak the same language in gaming, all of a sudden we're friends. That's pretty common. There is really a community among us. We sort of look out for each other. And I love this quote by Leonard Nimoy. The miracle is this: the more we have, the more we share. There was an instance where I was gathering data at a convention, 2015, and that's that next bullet point. And a guy came up to my table, he filled out the survey, we talked for a little while, it was a really great conversation, he left. He came back to the table a little while later and said, "Excuse me, Dr. Kuniak, did you happen to see my wallet?" Now, my heart sunk into my stomach for this guy. The convention was being attended by between 90 and 100,000 attendees. That would be kind of like, in my mind, of dropping your wallet in one of the big NFL stadiums or something like that and hoping that you found it again. I presume this guy was not going to get his wallet back. Like, I just felt awful for him. But that was the last place he thought of was my table, came back, I didn't see his wallet. I apologized, I said I'd keep my eye out for it, he disappeared. He came back about an hour later and he said, "I just wanted to, you're trying to do a good thing here, you talk to people about this stuff, I want to tell you, I went up to the customer service area in the convention, they had my wallet. All of my money was still in it, all his cards were still there. Someone found it on the convention floor and brought it right up to the will call area. They didn't take any of his money or anything like that. Where would you," and he said, this was Boston, he said, "if I had lost my wallet on the street outside the convention center, I don't think I ever would have got it back. But I lost it in the convention center with a horde of 90,000 people. I got my wallet back with all the money in it." That's pretty significant, right? Like, can you expect to get that if you were walking down the street in Harrisburg and just dropped your wallet somewhere, your purse? Would you ever get it back? No offense, Harrisburg. So, what else makes a culture? One of the things that was on that list from Ruth and Manning was communication, language. Gamers speak to each other using a very unique language. That, by the way, is a depiction of a character named Leroy Jenkins. YouTube that. Like, go and look for Leroy Jenkins. It's had over 11 million views. It's just it's a little YouTube video of a group of guys in World of Warcraft playing together, and there's this interaction, and this one guy was not in the room as they were all talking about this very involved raid that they were going to do. And when Leroy gets back in the room, his character just stands up and runs into the room that they were planning on going in, shouting his name, and he gets his entire group gets killed. So that has become, like, Leroy Jenkins has become a sort of a caricature of that gamer, that guy who isn't paying attention, just rushes in, sword in hand. I have a good friend who is my group's Leroy. But we use those terms. Like, if I called you a Leroy, you would have no idea what it was. But when I call my friend Greg Leroy, he knows exactly what he just did. So see, these are some of the terms. I'm actually compiling, one of my summer projects is to compile a dictionary of gaming words, because there's this entire language that we use. So noob, person who's new to the game. Pwned, it's like owning someone, it's beating someone profusely in a game. So if I really do a good job of beating you in the game, I pwned you. I don't know where that came from. I presume just the O and the P keys on the keyboard are close together and someone accidentally did it and then it caught on. AFK. AFK stands for away from keyboard. But if I was going, like, if I'm in a game, so say my buddies and I, 5 of us against 5 other people are in a game, and we want to communicate that there's a guy on the other team who's not moving around, he's probably not holding his controller, we should probably go after that guy. That takes a long time. Instead I could just say, so-and-so's AFK, they know, right? Language is important, it communicates a lot of information in a much more condensed sort of format. AFK is still the same if you're saying away from controller, we've never changed it to AFC. But it conveys something, right? Leroying, I described, if my console is bricked, that's a term we use, it's dead. It's like a brick, it's just useless. So if my Xbox at home bricked itself, dead console. Camping, which is a viable strategy for anyone who may be watching at home. Camping is a term that's used, so if I was playing in a shooter game, if I had a sniper rifle and hid in a corner and waited for everyone else to run around in front of me and shoot them, I'm a camper because I've just set up camp. I put a tent over myself, put the gun out of the tent, waiting for everybody to come to me. So that's also important, right? Maybe Carol can attest to the fact that people hate campers. Because you're running around and you're trying to meet your objectives and then all of a sudden you die out of nowhere. Hate those campers, but it's a viable strategy. But this is some of our language, and there is much more. Thinking and artistic expression was the next part of that definition. I love some of the artwork that's out there in gaming. So that's from Minecraft. You guys have heard of Minecraft, multi-billion-dollar game right now. Minecraft is an interesting story because it got created by a small studio. It looks basically like video game Legos that you're in and you're playing around with. Minecraft was bought by Microsoft for something like $1 billion or something like that, which is both, and I love this, there was a post online about what that looks like. So the person writing the post, it was from Penny Arcade, talked about Minecraft was bought for, and again, I'm not sure of the specific amount, but about $1 billion roughly. That's both the largest amount of money I can imagine, because I've never seen that in one space, and also insignificant when you consider that Microsoft just bought a generation of human beings for that amount of money, right? So, because everybody knows Minecraft, everybody plays Minecraft. My houses don't look like that in Minecraft, just throwing that out there. But isn't that incredible? Like out of little blocks, block by block, someone built that. It's probably a group of people. But if you went inside, that would be even more in-depth, interesting artwork in the game. A lot of games have some beautiful imagery to them and beautiful storytelling. And so I think that seeing a little bit of that artistic expression is important because a lot of times we think of games as an activity, but some folks see games as art form. Journey was one of the first video games to earn a Grammy for its musical composition. That's now, like, that happens pretty frequently. There are game scores that earn Grammys all the time. I love cosplayers. I think their artistic expression is fantastic. So I took that picture while I was gathering my dissertation data. Those folks are dressed as characters from a game. So it's not just I play the game, but I want to be a part of the game, or I would like to embody some value system or part of the character from the game, and so I dress as that. And they work so hard on those costumes. It's incredible. So just some other forms of artistic expression. Lastly, well, the social factors of gaming, I think, are most important in my mind because I was always told gaming is this very isolationist activity, and it can be. Certainly sitting at home on my console, I might not be interacting with a lot of folks, or it might not look like I'm interacting with a lot of folks. But gaming can be very, very socially engaging. So that's actually a group of my friends and I playing in my one friend's basement. We used to put all of our TVs together. We called it the Fortress Digitalis. It's not a very honorable form of gaming because we can all see each other's screens, so it gives us an advantage over the players who are not playing like that. But it's also, like camping, a viable strategy. That was for one of our birthdays or something like that. We would always just, all of my friends hauled their TVs together. We had to be a very strange group for anybody who's observing us. But
Like my son does that.
yeah,
With
but isn't
his
it?
friends.
Yeah, but
That's what my basement looked like in
Yeah.
April.
yeah, absolutely. It's great. But so that to me is very counter to the idea of isolationist gaming because we are actually physically coming together to do this activity as a group. You know, and we're talking to each other and we're sharing stories, not even about the game. We're sharing stories about the rest of our lives and everything else that's going on. And we order pizza, we take a break, we jump back into the game. I would question if you think that that's odd. What is different about that than, say, like Sunday morning football, right? Yeah. That is PAX. That's where I gathered my dissertation data. Those are all people at those tables. They're all playing together. Again, huge, huge grouping of people playing together. So I think that the communal nature of gaming is really important. Those folks paid a large sum of money and traveled in some instances across the world to be together, to spend a weekend together doing something that they loved. Not isolationism, to me, maybe to someone else. Show you some other stuff. That's a queue line in the way into the con. So like people get there early, they all stand in line in these big cattle rows, waiting to get to the convention floor. Just masses of human beings. I once described this as like swimming through people at the cons. That's where I was gathering my dissertation day, and I looked over a window and I looked down onto the convention floor. Everyone's getting along. There are rarely fights at these events. Rarely. I mean, I don't even know of any. I'm just saying rarely because I don't have the data to say never. Most of the folks get along with each other pretty well. Okay, so culture. I come from an Italian background on one side of my family, and so I try to sort of draw a line of comparison here. A lot of folks would identify that an ethnic background is cultural, right? Like those two words seem to go hand in hand to each other. And so these are some of the imagery and items that are important from my family growing up back in the day. Now pizza I just use because it's stereotypical. We didn't actually eat a ton of pizza in my Italian family, but pictures like that were on my grandparents' walls. My grandfather had a shirt like that. The book, like the language, all parts of a culture, right? So my wife and I are from the Pittsburgh area, and if we start to make that shift from culture as an ethnic background to culture from that multicultural perspective in counseling that I was talking about, can you see some similarities? Like the ways in which we interact, the clothing that we wear, the shared goals, shared values, shared language. Pittsburghese is a thing. If you're not familiar with it, I don't know. I specifically kept this in because I know there are a lot of Philly fans in Central I just wanted to kind of like turn that knife a little bit more. But it makes sense, right? Like these are things that if I said a sports culture, you would get it, right? So these are, I actually own all of those things. It's my favorite video game of all time, Halo. Sure, the clothing, the artifacts, the movies, the games themselves, the books. Like, I can immerse myself in a gaming culture just as much as I could in a sports culture, just as much as I could in my ethnic culture, etc. So I hope that that looks similar for you all. There is gaming food too. It's a terrible marketing strategy from my perspective, but companies will do this where like Mountain Dew will sponsor a game, and so you can drink their new color of Mountain Dew or something like that and earn points for in the game. I didn't want to promote it. So, no offense, Mountain Dew. Another thing to consider is that video games are one thing. I know we're talking a lot about digital technology today, but gaming is bigger than that. So video game, I would also tabletop game. I would also play role-playing games. There's not a really strong division between each of those. Like one will lead to the other, will lead to the other. We just enjoy interacting with each other as gamers. My wife and I have started buying a bunch of tabletop games recently to go and play with our friends in the same way I would play with some of my friends on our consoles. So, yeah. So there's an evolution of gaming that's gone on. I love this quote about, to anyone who came of age after the introduction of the first Sony PlayStation, gaming is just a central part of our lifestyle, right? Like, so from that age on, I'm trying to think about when that even came out, the first Sony PlayStation. I was in high school, I think. Thank you. Many folks are basically born with controller in hand at this point. Like for many of the youth of today, gaming is just a part of it, right? It's more normal than it is abnormal. So for those of you who are not as familiar with gaming, I wanted to kind of show the transition. So for many folks, when I've done presentations like this with mental health professionals, this is like the last game that people remember. Like this era was the last time that, when I say gaming, it's either like Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto. They don't know what those look like, but they've heard of those. This is the last thing that they remember seeing. So Super Mario Brothers, like early 1980s, right? nice 8-bit graphics. Still popular. Retro gaming is hugely popular still. I mean, I don't know if you've seen Nintendo, who are brilliant at putting out other peripheral products and stuff like that, are releasing classic NES and classic SNES systems every holiday and making a ton of money off of it. They're tiny little versions of the consoles with all the games preloaded on them. Retro gaming is huge. So that's what that looked like. It's Mario now, a little bit more advanced, right? Show you some of my favorites. So that's a scene from Halo. I know it's a little bit hard to see with the lights as they are. Just trying to
Come down. Oh, there you go.
for the purposes of this part of the discussion. Doesn't look like 1980s Mario anymore, right? That's the most recent Assassin's Creed game. Takes place in Egypt. It actually has an educator mode in this. So if you wanted to just like, if teachers wanted to show what ancient Egypt looked like, you could buy or get an educator's copy of Assassin's Creed Origins, and it takes out all of the action. And you can just kind of walk around ancient Egypt in the game, which I think is a really cool feature that they introduced this year. Very, very realistic, historically significant time frame for these games. They come out with an Assassin's Creed about every year or 2 years. Always wow us with the graphics in them. This is the most recent Legend of Zelda. I chose it because I didn't want to show all games that look photorealistic. Some games choose to have a very unique art style to them, and so Legend of Zelda is it's a classic, but it's still, I think, extremely engaging, but you can see that it has kind of a stylized art style to it. Some games are just incredibly beautiful how they design them, and the artistic choices that they make are unique. And then lastly, this is a current favorite of mine, Sea of Thieves. You're just a pirate. Like, you load up the game, you're a pirate. You have a ship, just do what you want. You can sail around, you can hunt for buried treasure, you can fight other pirates, you can just sit on the beach, whatever you want. But it has some of the most spectacular water effects I've ever seen in a game. Just incredible. So I actually found out that there's a guy who live streams this. I was just telling my wife this weekend. There's a guy who live streams scenes from Sea of Thieves. He just goes into the game with his character, stands on a hilltop, and just streams what he's seeing so that other people can have a beach scene on their computers and stuff. So as I've been grading papers, I've been letting Sea of Thieves, like the splashing of the waves and the water and stuff like that, go on my other screen, and it has been beautifully therapeutic. If you find the guy in the game and wave at him, he gives you stuff. I haven't found him yet because I've been at work. I said streaming. Is anybody familiar? Well, I'm asking as I'm looking for your nods or not nods. Has anyone ever heard of live streaming games? Because that's a thing now. It's an entire business practice where people play video games, other people watch, and people earn money being professional gamers, either from the people who are donating to them or from the sponsorship that they're getting from some of the organizations that they are playing for. So if you're really good at this, if you can, it takes a lot of work. I think a lot of kids will come in. I've had kids come into my office. My wife has had kids come into her office and talk about, I'm going to be a professional gamer. It's not that easy. You have to actually basically run your own TV show at specific hours, like all the technical aspects of it, et cetera, and keep an audience engaged in what you're doing and talk to your audience and catch up with your audience on Twitter and on social media and stuff like that afterwards, and actually build up your own television network. But you can do it, and some people make a very lucrative sum of money being pro gamers. They receive sponsorship from, say, the Microsofts and Sonys of the world, who, you have the audience, they're going to give you a free copy of their game so that you can play it. They may pay you just like in professional sports and stuff like that, have sponsors and things of that sort. It's the same thing. Esports is another huge trend in gaming. So you'll see people pack a stadium to watch people play League of Legends. I'm trying to think of some of these. Overwatch has its own league now. Certain colleges and universities are now getting pro gaming teams to tour around and do stuff just like they would have a football team or a baseball team or something like that. Huge money and interest in esports. What's interesting about that though too is because of the live streaming aspects of this, you will see, like I remember they did a comparison of like the MLB, the end of the season MLB games versus some Overwatch games or some League of Legends games, more people were tuning in because it's the entire world audience on these esports games than were on the Major League Baseball finals and stuff like that, because the interest is that high. Some other trends that you're seeing, you heard them talk today about virtual reality. There's also augmented reality, if you're familiar with Pokemon Go. That's an augmented reality game where you're taking things that are happening in the real world and overlaying a virtual world on top of it. And now we're coming out with mixed reality headsets where they do both. So you can have holograms in the real world, or holograms in the virtual world playing out on top of real world scenes and things of that sort. Microsoft is doing a lot of stuff with that recently. You can get an educator's mixed reality headset for like $5,000. I don't know if we have a budget for that. I'd love to play with it if we did. But there's a video online you can look up that has someone building Minecraft worlds with their fingers on top of a table, looking through the mixed reality headset. That's just a couple of years out at this point, if not sooner. The headsets are coming out, I think, now. But to use it in that way is so okay. So I got you caught up on culture. I did all that to get you caught up on why this is important, why I would look into this, and how I define all of this stuff. So why is it important to me as a mental health professional? So our ethics code calls us to be multiculturally focused. I think a lot of professionals have a very similar sort of bend right now, and I know one of the mission components of the college is to take a look at diversity issues and things of that sort. Gaming is multicultural in and of itself. It is a subculture that draws in various different ethnic backgrounds, belief systems, religious and spiritual aspects. We all get along with each other, which is, again, kind of unique. The therapeutic relationship is so important for counseling. If you're not familiar with the counseling process, us mental health professionals have identified that you could do nothing else, but if you had a strong relationship, a strong therapeutic alliance with your client, and they believed that you were caring about them and willing to help them, change will happen. Certainly we think we have some other tools that we can use to help people, but that therapeutic alliance is primary. So if I'm struggling, and this is actually how I landed on this research area, if I'm struggling with getting my client to join with me, to be in line with me, and to believe that I care about them, but we have all of these same interests, value systems, experiences, etc., I bridge months of therapeutic work to be able to get my client to meet me where they are and to be able to make effective change with them. And lastly, we really need to understand our clients, their weaknesses and their strengths. And if this is a part of if they identify this as a part of their strength system, I really have to give a nod to that, even if I don't totally buy into it. Now I do, but even if I don't, I owe it to them to identify with them their strength areas. There's some stuff about benefits on here that I think is important, but most uniquely, I think, for everyone that's in the room is this blog here. Jane McGonigal wrote about this in her book, Reality is Broken. Reality is Broken, the framework of what makes up a game. Look at that, those 4 points, and tell me if that is not kind of the exact same thing that you would expect in your classrooms. We're all educators in here, right? Would you not wish your students would identify with clearly defined goals, understand your rules and abide by them? That you had a constant feedback system that was helping them to learn? Wouldn't that be useful for teaching and learning? And lastly, wouldn't we all hope for voluntary participation from our students? Those are the 4 components of any game. In that way, if you look at all of those things, voluntary participation, so you have to go and you have to sign on and you have to be a part of the game, right? So let's look at golf. So is golf a game? If I'm going and actually actively going to participate in golf, I'm a voluntary participant. There's a constant feedback system. Every time my ball is going in the wrong places or in the right places, it's telling me what's happening and I'm adjusting accordingly to that. There are rules to golf. There's a reason why I can't adjust it. I would love to pick up the ball, walk across the green, and drop the ball in the hole. I would win every time, but there are rules. And there are clearly defined goals. Again, the goal is get the ball in the hole, but you have to do it with a stick. You have to do it from tons of yards away, and then we threw all sorts of stuff away. But in that same way, golf is the same as Call of Duty. I log in, there are rules in the game, there's an objective that's being communicated to me, and there's a constantly, in the case of Call of Duty, a constantly evolving feedback system that is telling me what to do, how to do it, and how to adjust accordingly to it. But that's no different than what we hope happens in the classroom, right? We hope. I threw this in there just for your consideration. I mentioned it earlier. I don't know when I would get another chance to have a bunch of educators in the room. There has been a statement made recently from a political perspective about games should have a rating system. Games have a rating system. We've had a rating system since 1994. The question is, are we abiding by it, and are we actually, following it, etc.? But it's been there. I get carded when I go in to buy a game. I have to show my ID, check to make sure I'm 17 plus.
Now telling people now too.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point. So I just heard from a friend of mine who works for a gaming sales store. I can't think of words now. They're actually educating people before they buy. So like, not only do you get carded, but they're going to tell you why the game is rated what it's rated, so you know, so that there's no question. Can you find the rating on that game? If you open up the game disc, I should have brought one. It's on the game disc itself, it's on the back, it's on the front, it's on the instruction manual. If you go to buy these online, it's big, posted on the video screen, you can't miss it. So games have been rated since 1994. I think it's just important to know that. All right, so here's what I did. So I looked at gamer demographics. This is my research study. I looked at demographics, all that stuff that I just talked about. I had various variables for all of these different sorts of underpinnings for culture. I had a measure of gamer personality. I had a measure of coping strategies, and lastly, I had a measure of psychological resiliency. And I was trying to cross-correlate to see if any of those things linked up, if they linked up in any meaningful ways. I really had no idea what I was going to see. I really didn't, because to my knowledge, there was never a study done like this before. Gaming research is kind of still in its infancy. It's getting more involved. There are studies coming out monthly now, whereas before, when I did my lit review was a challenge. Like trying to find useful research that was current was a challenge. So that's what I looked at, and this is what I found. So according to the coping strategies measure that I was using, engagement coping levels were extremely high. And that kind of makes sense, right? I didn't think about this, but after I looked at it, it made sense. Gamers are puzzle solvers. So if you're looking at any sort of coping strategy that they use, which is important for us mental health professionals, and I think for anyone who cares about anyone else to know, what is a good method of helping someone. If you can engage them in activities, if you can give them a problem to solve, if you can frame their problems in a way that is measurable and useful, they'll problem solve it. There was just a study that was put out this past weekend about 6 new neurons were discovered. I think it was Princeton University just completed a study where they were mapping neurons and they found 6 new neurons. That was actually found by the researchers at Princeton farming out the research to a group of 1.5 million gamers who discovered 6 new neurons. The researchers just changed the study to make it a game and then put it out there to the crowd, and they discovered 6 new neurons. Any problem that exists in the world, if you can frame it in a game and give it to the gamers, they'll solve it. But yeah, so engagement coping was really high. The catch to this is when time increased for the level of engagement they had, the coping levels would drop dramatically. So there is a cutoff for utility. It's not necessarily a cutoff in time for identifying whether or not you're a gamer, but after a certain point, you're engaging so much in the game, you're losing the benefit of the game, right? So Jane McGonigal in her book talks about 7 hours, 21 hours a week is about max potential for a game to be useful according to her research. So you figure about 3 hours a day, and you're getting some benefit out of the game. Go over that, and you see a sharp decline in the utility of the game, because you're spending so much time in the virtual space, you're not carrying it over, is the theory. Personality types were noticeably high for problem solving. That was across the gamer personality metric. But lastly, and I think most importantly for me, resiliency levels were found to be noticeably high. And that's important for me because psychological resiliency is a factor that we look at to understand whether or not a person can bounce back from problematic situations. Stereotypically, I went into this, I was hoping that I would find this, but the data was supporting more so that gamers are not very resilient individuals, that they, again, bury themselves in their activities, avoid real-life circumstances, hide in their mom's basements. I know I said that doesn't happen, but resiliency levels were really high. So that shows me that they do have an ability to bounce back from adverse life situations. And And so now I'm asking myself how and what does this look like? So that led to my next study, which I'm still working on. So I'm trying to look at this now from a wellness perspective, and I'm trying to figure out what personal motivations are towards gaming, because I don't think I've looked at that very well. And I think that that's a significant part of identifying who is or is not a gamer. So personal motivations, and I don't have a metric for that, I just kind of asked. So I'm still pulling through the data and trying to figure out exactly what all I've found. One of the things that I want to note is that I did, one of the sets of questions that I asked was around orientation towards seeking out mental health help or not. And so there were a large group of people, and I don't have the numbers, I haven't run it through SPSS yet, but there was a large number of people who identified that they would be willing to seek a counselor. However, in the follow-up question, they would only be willing to seek that counselor if that counselor was going to be gamer-friendly. They would not seek help if they felt like they were going to be put down for their behaviors, which I think makes sense. I mean, if you were going to go and seek help from someone and you thought they were going to look down on you for something that you identified with, whatever that is, would you go? Would you put yourself through that? It's unlikely, and my numbers are kind of showing that, which I think is important. So yeah, that's what I'm doing now, is trying to understand this at a deeper level. I think I've got some good data as far as what makes a gamer, or what might make a gamer. But I really, really am curious about this personal motivation and personal identification component, because I think that's a big part of it. So there's some of the research that I cited, and there's some of the ways that you can check my stuff out. Any questions?
The cake is not alive, first.
Oh yeah, I like titling my presentations after quotes in the media that I'm using. So like I did a presentation on ethics, and I titled it An Ethical Code from a More Civilized Time, which is from Star Wars. When he talks about an elegant weapon from a more civilized time, the lightsaber. So The Cake is Not a Lie is actually a line from a game called Portal. Portal is a fantastic game. If you've never heard of it, you should just look it up. Portal is one of the first games where they just put you in a room and you have to figure out actually the entire premise of the game. The game doesn't tell you what to do. You end up being in a science experiment with an evil robotic overlord who is trying to study you, who wants to gather data. And so she keeps pushing you along through the game, telling you that there will be cake at the end. And then at one point you get into a room where you find all of her previous research subjects have scrawled on the walls, "The cake is a lie," because she's killing them all, you know, through her experiments. So I love the idea. And then of course, you know, Gladys, the robot overlord, who is testing you, is encouraging you that the cake is not a lie. Just go into this next acid-filled chamber and get across this area and so forth. So one of my other favorite quotes from that is, "Look at me still talking while there's science to do." So yeah, Portal. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah.
What was the mean age of your survey respondents? Just because we teach 18 to 21-year-olds, and I feel like perhaps their decision-making in this equation is a big piece developmentally that's often a challenge.
So developmental concerns are always a component to any of the decision-making stuff that's going on. The mean age, I'd have to look at the specific age, but it was within the 30s range. It lined up consistently with what the ESA's research was. So I can get you the specific number, but yeah, it's a little older than the 18 to 20-ish age range.
Well, so I guess, I don't know if this is true for anybody else, but I came because I teach engineers. Stereotypically, a large population of them are choosing to spend a lot of time gaming instead of doing their homework.
Yeah.
So could you speak of maybe some ways that I or we could connect with them and help them maybe make good decisions?
So I will say that I think that all of this still applies to an 18 to 20-ish age range.
Absolutely. It's been very useful, but could you extend it a little bit?
I would think, so this is what I tell people in my profession, and I think it is actually applicable to an education perspective. Ask them what they're playing, ask them why they're playing it, and ask them to see it. And then see if they can make some connections between what they're playing and what you're doing, and have that conversation. I did a lecture here back in February, and I told a group of mental health professionals that same sort of rubric. And I actually had several counselors email me back and say, "I didn't believe you, but I started asking my clients this stuff, and we've made a lot of progress. So and I'll tell you why I think that that's the case. First off, it's going to give you the information that you need. So you don't know what they're playing, they're probably not necessarily sharing, but asking them is going to get you that data. Secondly, we like to talk about this stuff. If you ask me what I'm playing and why I like playing it, I will talk to you for hours about that. I'll tell you every aspect of why it's important to me. That's going to give you a window into my value system, my method of communication, all that stuff in that cultural piece that I was talking about. And it's also going to make me believe that you care about me, most importantly. So I think that that's a huge bridging and start point for any of the work that we're doing is, what are you playing, why? And can you tell me about it, or can you show me something about it? Because they will. They'll bring their Xbox in and show you. I would. Oh.
I don't know your name, miss.
Emily?
Emily? All right. Is this a situation where you're teaching engineering students who are gaming too much and know that they're gaming too much and wish that they wouldn't?
They just tell me that. I didn't include it
Okay.
when I stayed up all night playing video games.
Right.
Oh, okay.
I have a trick for that. That's the thing that got me through graduate school. You can't pull this off by willpower because that's what you're missing. So what you have to do is get away from the place that has all your toys and go someplace where you have no toys to play with, but you also don't want any of the distractions around you or anything like that, right? And you bring your books or you bring your homework, and that's the only thing that you can work with, and then you get stuff done.
I think the hard part with that though is everything is so computer focused.
Right.
I know that a lot of times, I know if you
That's why I
have
wrote
the
my
same role
dissertation on
with
pen and paper.
with self-control with that, you know, when is it okay to enjoy that piece, and that when can you have that self-control to walk away and say, you know what, I need to get this done. And I think in this world of being in the computer world, where a lot of the students are doing their assignments on the computer, they can't break that.
That is certainly a very real problem because I mean, I don't know that it's true for everyone, right? It was the one thing that worked for me and worked for my friends is getting away from all your distractions, getting away from all your toys so that you don't have them to tempt you anymore. But if you're doing your work on the computer,
I usually suggest students turn their Wi-Fi off and start to make more, a few more
and the
things.
temptation's
Just
there
a little bit
still.
more.
I think there are ways around it, and I think that part of it is admitting to the problem that's going on. And I like what you say about the, the problem is the willpower piece. Because that's why I ask folks sometimes, and certainly I've asked folks in my office why they play what they play. Because if we can find another way to do that thing, so like if you like it because of this reason or you're doing it because of that reason, well maybe we can get you to use all of those tools in a different way. But I like what you're saying where the willpower is the issue, so you do have to remove yourself from it. So combine those to some degree. I don't know, and I've struggled with this with some of my clients. I'd like to say that I have foolproof experience, solving these problems, but I can't make people do things. And so if I can't get them to shut off the Xbox and try something different, then we never do anything different, But if I can get them, I think, to trust me a little bit and to try something new, that's the first step, and that's why I ask them what I ask them.
I wasn't sure if you had any tips, like as far as like suggestions, like for the student, the
Well,
typical student.
I'll tell you, so when I was writing my dissertation, I desperately wanted to do other things than write my dissertation. My dissertation chair said for himself, his car was never so clean as when he was writing his dissertation, right? And it was the same for me. So I had to create a value system and a willpower component for myself where I simply wouldn't allow myself to game at all until I finished XYZ. Then I would, and I would indulge myself, but I had to get 500 more words written before I could do this thing. I basically gamified my assignments in order to get through those, and then I will admit that sometimes I was so tired after I did I got to do 10 more pages, I didn't play my game, but I got my work done. But I would entice myself to do that. I would set up my own rules, set up my own stuff. That's what worked for me.
That's a good suggestion.
Just wondering if you could speak to sort of if there's different psychologies associated with different types of games. So for example, you mentioned Halo, sort of similar games where you can sort of play multiple rounds of more or less the same thing. and then when you turn it back on, you're sort of starting from scratch, or you're sort of more of the same. Versus games that might come with a sense of accomplishment. So for example, these massive MMORPGs that where you have someone who there's continuity in a sense that if on a level whatever 52 character that represents, and whether that with the one sense it's sort of like, well, if you're playing bridge, you play 6 hands of bridge, and then you're sort of maybe you're done for a while, and sort of similar with maybe some of those games versus, but you don't really get a sense of playing bridge that you ever are. I'm not a level 52 bridge player, and I don't wear that around. Whereas with some of these games, is there a psychological difference with a sense of maybe a false sense even of accomplishment that look what I've done, and it's not I would say real compared to say the thesis.
Yeah, well, and so as part of my dissertation, I used a gamer personality metric, and it looked at some of that stuff. So there are different motivations for gamers. Some people just want to play in order to interact socially, in order to play the Halo and do the multiplayer round over and over again. It racks up your points, but you're not necessarily gaining anything other than more time spent in the game, more time socializing. Whereas like you talked about the MMOs, I play a game called Destiny. In that game, my level is constantly increasing, and then I also get emblems occasionally for completing certain tasks, and I will wear those emblems, and there are bragging rights associated with that. So I do both, but I don't know of any particular sort of psychological component to that other than the gamer personality tests that are out there. You can look them up. The one I used was called Brain Hex. It's free to use. You could take it and use it with students, etc. And it kind of asks them a bunch of different questions and then scores them into a category for what is their primary motivator. And I do think that says something about the person. I just haven't really studied that particular area yet. But the Brain Hex actually does talk about some of that stuff, though. So certainly I can even get you the links to it if you want to email me about it. Everybody's so friendly.
Is it possible to encourage students, like Emily was talking, where you work for an hour and your reward would have been after the 500 pages, but maybe to have a student 20 minutes on a game and then get off and go back to studying? Is that possible? I've heard they're designed to be addictive.
Well, so it's not that they're necessarily designed to be addictive as much as they are designed to be incredibly rewarding. And rewards can be addictive. So like, it's the same as I really like sugar and coffee and things like that sort of stuff. All of these can be very addictive. So you're asking me, can I make an entire pot of coffee, drink a cup, let that go, do other things, come back to it? Sure, I can. Some people can. Some folks can play 20 minutes of a game and stop. Other folks, and certainly I've run into this with families where the question is, yeah, I tell him to get off and he says there's no save point. Like games don't have the ability to save all the time like they used to. Every game is different. So you have to, the answer is yes, that is possible. It may not be as clean as that though. And so that's why I would encourage myself when I've been working with folks, I've encouraged them to get the other stuff done first before you game because it's so easy. I've gone into Minecraft with the intention of I will be in here for an hour and then I look outside and it's dark. I don't know where 6 hours went, I tell a story about a friend of mine who we looked outside and we saw the sun going down and we were commenting about how beautiful the sunset was until we realized that that was the sun coming up.
Wow.
That was one night in college. He always prefaces that with that's the light is returning story. So you can lose track of time, and so I'd be very cautious about that because I do think there are people who can, but I would be cautious. Yeah, it's just too easy.
Thank you so much. This has been a really awesome presentation.
Thank you.
And I don't think we've met. My name is Wes Bernstein, and I'm with IT, and I'm a digital media specialist here. And one of the things that we've done is we've kind of consulted with people, and we did a similar presentation. Well, I facilitated, along with Cindy Kearns, a similar presentation last summer. We talk about sort of introducing elements of gaming in your pedagogy, and I'm not sure if maybe some of this can apply to some of you, but one of the things that I think might help resonate with some of us. This morning when Dr. Harris kind of talked about thinking about how technology is more of ecology and rather than a tool, I think if we can start thinking about gaming as sort of that ecology where some of us do need to tune out, and for some of your students, the answer might be you need to separate your sort of addictive elements, but I think also some of us need to just become more familiar with what these students are engaged with, and to some degree, like I know that you have done research on online gaming and done therapy through online gaming, but we all participate in some sort of gaming to a degree, whether it be like tabletop gaming, we can do it on our phones, but you know, I have a parent who just loves watching Jeopardy and trying to answer those Jeopardy questions, and we did a Jeopardy COE event. And so in terms of like gaming and gaming culture, I think there's a way that we can sort of start moving away from the stigma that gaming culture is a separate culture. But I do think that some of us don't necessarily think about gaming, especially in terms of formal academic instruction. And we can, it's just a different approach. It's just a different way of approaching your pedagogy. Some people, I remember in middle school doing those sort of Jeopardy type games where you would participate in terms of a quiz. But we can also do role-playing things, we do exercises, and sports and things like that are great analogies. We don't necessarily think about how a student athlete may spend all this time exercising or doing things like that and come in fatigued, but there's a similar parallel there. And I think maybe to some degree, what this presentation can hopefully bring about is that maybe gaming culture isn't so necessarily distinct, but maybe some of us have different stigmas attached to that, and we need to figure out or become more familiar with different types of gaming. And you definitely have a lot of experience with like video gaming and online gaming and RPG gaming, but Cynthia Lehman, who just left, she has a ton of experience with tabletop gaming. And we talk a lot about how tabletop gaming, or even card games and poker games, like that can be a really good way of assimilating some of your principles. In a class that I teach, we do a 10-minute exercise as both a social sort of engagement feature, but we just do interactive games, and we do games where we do like a telephone game or something like that, where you have to simulate or charades or some sort of activity to get people familiar with gaming as a very easy and common concept, but also to some degree to include some of that pedagogy. And I think it's just more sort of like a cultural.
So, in terms of what you just said, I teach a course called Intro to Game Design. It's primarily computer science, but we do have some engineers who come in and participate in it. So if any of you have an aspect of what you're teaching in your class that you think maybe we can turn this into a game, my students, when they get into the team level part, are required to create a game that has redeeming social value. So if anyone would be interested in doing that, just let me know. I'm not any thoughts on it.
Thank you. I got feedback from the group. You good?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.